Think of a clock with no hands. You can see the mechanism, the gears, the springs, the precision, but someone removed the face before you arrived. That's what happened to Philippine history. The machinery was always there. Someone just made sure you'd never read the time. 1,000 years before the American Founding Fathers debated representation in Philadelphia, communities across the Philippine archipelago were already solving the same problem. Not with wigs and candlelight, let's say, with a system so structurally sophisticated that modern political scientists, when they finally looked closely, had trouble dismissing it as primitive. This is not mythology. This is governance, the barangay. That single word carries more political weight than most people realize. Today, Filipinos know it as a neighborhood unit, the smallest administrative division of the modern state. But strip away the colonial rebranding, and what you find underneath is something far older. Something that functioned as a self-governing community with its own laws, its own leadership structure, and its own mechanisms for collective decision-making, centuries before those concepts had formal names in Western political theory. Interesting fact, the word itself comes from barangay, a large outrigger vessel capable of carrying entire families across open ocean. Communities that arrived together stayed together. They named their social unit after the boat that brought them. That detail matters. It tells you something about how these people understood belonging, not as something granted from above, but as something built together through shared risk and shared arrival. A barangay typically consisted of 30 to 100 households. Each had a leader called the datu. And here is where the easy assumption collapses, because the datu was not a king, not an emperor, not a divine ruler in the European mold. Power came from demonstrated capacity, social trust, and accumulated obligation. There's a catch. A datu led because the community allowed it. The position carried weight only so long as the leader maintained the confidence of the free men, the ordinary members of the community known as the Timawa in Visayan society, or the Maharlika among the Tagalogs. These were not serfs. They were not subjects in the feudal sense. They held real social standing, they bore arms, and they could, and did, transfer their loyalty to another datu if the current one failed them. Stop and consider what that mechanism actually means. The threat of defection was the check on power. No term limits written in law, no parliament to impeach a failing ruler. The accountability was structural, embedded in the social fabric itself. A datu who made bad decisions lost followers. A datu who lost followers lost everything. That is not so different from the political arithmetic of democratic accountability. The form was different. The function was strikingly similar. But let's be precise here. This was not democracy as Athens defined it. There was no open assembly where every voice received equal weight. Social stratification existed. There were alipin, people in states of debt bondage or dependency. The system had hierarchies, as every human system does. To romanticize it as a pristine egalitarian paradise would be dishonest. And yet the systems that govern daily life within barangay communities contain genuine deliberative elements that deserve serious examination. Disputes were settled through a process involving recognized arbiters. Community decisions of consequence were not made unilaterally. Consultation between the datu and senior community members was standard practice across the archipelago. The Spanish chroniclers who arrived in the 16th century documented this themselves, often with visible frustration, because it made conquest administratively complicated. One of the most striking pieces of evidence is the Code of Calantiao. And here we must pause, because this is also where the history gets tangled. For decades, the Code of Calantiao was cited as proof of pre-colonial legal sophistication, a detailed legal code from the 15th century attributed to a Datu named Calantiao of Panay. Philippine textbooks taught it as settled history. Then the historians moved in. In 2004, historian William Henry Scott, who had spent decades in Philippine archives, and others confirmed what earlier researchers had suspected. The Code of Calantiao was a fabrication, a 20th century invention created by Jose Marco and published in 1914, masquerading as an authentic pre-colonial document. The discovery had been accepted for so long that dismantling it took years of institutional resistance. That correction matters. Getting the history right matters more than protecting a comfortable story. But here is what the Calantiao episode actually reveals. And this is the part that tends to get buried under the scandal of the forgery. The fabrication was believable precisely because the underlying framework it described was real. Pre-colonial Philippine communities did have legal codes, did have structured mechanisms for justice. The most important surviving proof is the Maragtas, which itself has debated authenticity, but more concretely, the Laguna copperplate inscription. Dated to 900 CE, written in a script derived from Old Malay with Sanskrit loanwords, the Laguna copperplate is the oldest known written document found in the Philippines. And what does it record? Not a royal decree, not a divine proclamation, a legal transaction, a debt settlement, a formal release from obligation, witnessed and recorded with the precision of a society that understood documentation, contract, and legal accountability as ordinary instruments of social life. 900 years old. Older than Magna Carta by 3 centuries. A society that writes down debt settlements in 900 CE is not a society stumbling in darkness. That is a society with functioning commercial law, with notions of obligation and release, with a shared understanding that agreements between people carry binding weight, and that this weight is worth inscribing in metal. Now hold that image, because what comes next changes the meaning of everything established so far. The Spanish arrived in 1565 under Miguel López de Legazpi, and within decades, the barangay system, that intricate, distributed, self-governing network, was not destroyed. It was absorbed, repurposed. The Spanish were tactically brilliant enough to recognize that dismantling local governance entirely would require more military resources than they possessed. So instead, they preserved the structure and replaced the values inside it. Datas became cabezas de barangay, administrative intermediaries serving colonial tax collection rather than community welfare. All right, the shell survived. The soul was redirected. That transformation is crucial for understanding why the pre-colonial democratic impulse didn't simply evolve forward into modern institutions. It was interrupted, not by the inadequacy of the system, but by deliberate colonial administrative engineering. The people who argue that pre-colonial Philippines had no real political sophistication are, in many cases, working from sources written by the very colonizers who had strategic reasons to understate what they found. Consider the argument against this entire framing. There are serious scholars who push back on the label democratic as anachronistic projection. They argue, not without merit, that applying modern political vocabulary to pre-modern social structures distorts both. The Datu system was hereditary in many communities. The Alapin had no voice. Women's roles, while more complex than colonial sources suggest, varied enormously across regions, precisely regions. Calling this democracy might say more about our present desire for a usable past than about the actual experience of people living in a 14th century barangay. Think about it. That criticism has intellectual honesty behind it. Terminology matters. Precision matters. and yet the counter-argument stands on firmer ground. Democratic governance is not a single invention with a patent date. It is a recurring human solution to the problem of living together under shared constraints. Athens found one version. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy of North America found another. The Barangay system found its own. The mechanisms of consent, accountability, and collective decision embedded in pre-colonial Philippine governance are structurally cognate to democratic principles, even if the vocabulary arrived centuries later. Dismissing the barangay system as not really democratic because it didn't use that word is like dismissing fire because the people who discovered it didn't call it combustion. The question isn't whether ancient Filipinos were doing what Philadelphia did in 1776. The question is whether they had developed independently, organically, across thousands of islands and hundreds of distinct communities, functional answers to the same fundamental questions that democratic theory later formalized. The evidence says yes. The Laguna copperplate says yes. The Spanish colonial frustration with the complexity of local governance says yes. What was lost in 1565 was not recovered in 1898 when American colonial administrators arrived with their own version of democratic rhetoric and their own reasons for keeping Philippine self-governance limited. The irony is architectural. A people with a deeper democratic tradition than most of their colonizers were repeatedly told they needed to be taught self-governance. But there's a detail. The tradition was never absent. It was buried under successive layers of deliberate institutional amnesia. Modern Philippine political culture still carries the fingerprints of those interruptions in the patron-client dynamics that echo the corrupted Datu system, in the municipal barangay structure that preserved colonial administrative logic, in the ongoing tension between formal democratic institutions and the informal power networks that predate them by centuries. None of that is inevitable. None of it is genetic. It is historical, and history can be read differently. There is a version of the Philippine national conversation about governance and political reform that begins not with 1986, not with 1898, not even with 1565, but with the barangay arriving on the water, carrying 30 households who had crossed the open sea together and needed to decide collectively how to live on the shore they'd found. That version of the conversation changes what questions get asked. Instead of asking how the Philippines can adopt better democratic models, you ask how a tradition of self-governance, interrupted, corrupted, overlaid, might be recovered and rebuilt from roots that were always there. Go find the Laguna copperplate, not in a textbook description. Find the actual translation by Anton Postman, published in 1992, available in scholarly archives and digitized library collections. Read the document itself. Read what a community in 900 CE considered important enough to engrave in metal. Then ask yourself what political culture produces that kind of precision about obligation, justice, and recorded accountability. The answer has been waiting 900 years for the question.